We are back for the third and final portion of prehistory. Wasn't life awful? We'll look at their lives and lifespans here a little bit. This question and slide gets us back to the idea that we tend to underestimate these people, just like we tend to think they must have been like these dumb, brutish cavemen. We think their lives must have been terrible and awful. How horrible it must have been to live thousands of years ago. Well, yes and no. And I'm going to look at both sides of this in different ways. Myself, I'd certainly choose to live now as opposed to then if I had to make such a choice or could make such a choice. Nonetheless, the point that David Christian makes here, who we've already quoted, relying on a well-known anthropologist who wrote a book a couple decades ago that is controversial even now, called The Original Affluent Society. Christian quotes him and comments himself about Salem's, at the time, rather unorthodox claim that the people that we call hunter-gatherers actually had better lives and better lifestyle than we were led to believe. Again, it's still controversial. Plenty of anthropologists disagree. Christian sort of agrees. So Marshall Salem's, David Christian's comments on the original society claim that Stone Age society was a world of abundance, in the sense that most basic desires could be satisfied with a minimum of stress and effort. It may be that Salem's article, which eventually became a book, was a deliberate overstatement intended to counter a traditional view of human history that could see only progress in the transition from forager to farmer and industrial worker. There is little reason to think that life expectancies in the Stone Age and Stone Age societies were much above 30 or 40 years. And undoubtedly, many people died in ways that could now have been avoided. But there is no getting around the basic paradox that Salem's highlighted. The increasing productivity of human societies has created societies in which more is desired and less free time is available to enjoy what is available. So Salem's highlighted things like the average workday, which of course he had to estimate. I think he said somewhere like 4 something hours required to provide the basics, food and everything else, to keep the community alive and healthy, and that meant a lot of time left over for play and for visiting with friends and family, grandparents, children, etc., religious activities, and so forth, sports, whatever it may be. Ian Morris, who I've also quoted before, is talking about the downside of hunter-gatherer life, and in this case specifically reference to violence. He says in a recent book on the history of warfare going all the way back to prehistory, quote, people generally worked out their differences peacefully, but if someone decided to use force, there were far fewer constraints on him, or occasionally her, than the citizens of modern states are used to. Most of the killing was on a small scale in vendettas and incessant raiding, although once in a while violence might disrupt an entire band or village so badly that disease and starvation wiped all its members out. But because populations were small, the steady drip of low-level violence took an appalling toll. By most estimates, 10 to 20% of all the people who lived in Stone Age societies died at the hands of other human beings. 10 to 20%, an estimate, but that's a lot of death through violence, either warfare or murder. Now we move to the Neolithic Revolution, which, as its main feature, includes the move to agriculture, to farming and domestication of animals along with it. As one recent book in a chapter on the Neolithic Revolution calls history's biggest fraud. He didn't put the question mark in his chapter heading. I did. He is trying to make a dramatic statement, which he, I think, partially believes, maybe not completely. But he has a point. And quoting him now, young history professor who's taken kind of the world by storm. He's become kind of a superstar in recent years. A book called *Sapiens*, which I highly recommend that you read if you are interested in history. He says about 10,000 years ago, sapiens, meaning Homo sapiens, our species, began to devote almost all their time and effort to manipulating the lives of a few animals and plant species. From sunrise to sunset, humans sowed seeds, watered plants, plucked weeds from the ground, and led sheep to prime pastures. It was a revolution in the way humans lived, the agricultural revolution. There was no turning back from it. So this happened in different times, different places around the globe. It does appear now to be overwhelmingly likely to be true that farming started independently in multiple parts of the globe, not exactly the same time, but within a certain range of time. So it wasn't that farming was invented in one place or learned how to do in one place and then spread gradually around the world from there. It happened in 6 or so places, and then the number is not entirely clear, and then sort of spread regionally and continentally from those roughly 6. The Fertile Crescent in ancient Mesopotamia, where we'll be going soon, not literally. China, Mesoamerica, and the Americas, and some other places. Egypt, where we'll also be going soon. So why did people start to move to farming in the first place? It used to be assumed by scholars until fairly recent decades of scholarship that once people's hunter-gatherers learned farming, that they automatically would make the change to it, assuming that farming was better, that everybody would want the lifestyle and the food, the stable food supply that comes from farming, domestication of animals, assuming that it was stable, and they kind of were assuming that, which isn't always true. More recent scholarship, not all of it, has tended to focus on ways in which, or at least places in which, farming may not have been something that was desired, but something that was kind of forced on them, or that would even sort of entrap people, sometimes referred to as the trap of sedentism. Sedentism means sort of living in one place, not moving. This kind of began, this new way of thinking about the move from hunting gathering to farming, when a number of sites, archaeological sites, were found. Maybe the most famous and maybe the first one in this regard, the Natufians, you see on the screen there, in what's modern day Israel today, were found to be hunter-gatherers, but living in permanent dwellings, living in buildings and towns and cities. We didn't focus on this before, but we did say that hunter-gatherers, of course, were nomadic and moved around. That, of course, implies, and it's true, that they didn't build permanent villages, towns, and cities. They built campsites, so dwellings, much like tents, things that could either be just destroyed and built somewhere else, or taken down and carried lightly from one place to another. But it wouldn't have made sense for them to build cities if they're moving around. So it was somewhat of a shock at first when the Natufian peoples, their sites were excavated, and other places around the world. There's one in the Balkans. There's at least one in the U.S., modern day U.S., where the trap of sedentism may have happened, where it was found, again, surprisingly, that the people that had lived there were hunter-gatherers, but they built permanent structures. And it's not that, I think, once we know this, it actually doesn't, it's not shocking or surprising. It was only shocking at first because that had never been seen before. Why isn't it shocking? Well, hunter-gatherers, right, they only move around a lot because they have to. But what if there is a supply of food there naturally going wild plants and animals that are sort of there year-round to be, there to be taken by human beings, pardon the expression, then why would they move around? If there's an ample food, even if they don't know how to do farming, even if they haven't domesticated animals, if there's ample wild food there for the taking, then why would they move? The answer is they wouldn't and didn't. The Natufians, again, are the most famous example of this. So these people were, in a sense, in a Garden of Eden. They were in a place where there's so much food year round that they could start building, permanent homes, permanent villages, and do. So this uh, comes about and might help to explain how someone like the Natufians, at least some peoples in the world, moved to farming not by choice, but they got trapped. How could that happen? Well, if you are a hunter gatherer, but you're lucky enough to be able to stay put and hunt and gather nearby, your population goes up because, as we've already seen, food supply and population rise are coordinated. So you're doing really well on the Garden of Eden until one or two or more generations later, and your population now is booming. And oops, all of a sudden, there's not enough food to go around. Let's say it's a number of generations, like four. Uh, okay, so now we don't have enough food. It's also likely that many of these people, if not all of them, who were living in a sedentary way, permanent dwellings and villages, but still gathering wild, growing food and not farming, already had the knowledge to know how to farm. They might not have even thought of it that way, but they had the knowledge because they'd been dealing, and to domesticate animals, by the way. They'd been dealing with plants and animals, right, their whole lives, and their parents and gave them a lot of knowledge, handed down a great deal of understanding of them. So they probably already knew how to farm, which also might show how unattractive it appears to have been in some places. I mean, they knew how to farm and domesticate animals, and they chose not to. Yeah, because they had wild growing stuff and you know wild animals right there at their beck and call, practically. Uh, okay, so then once they start to run out of naturally growing food because their population is too large, why don't they just go back to hunting and gathering, sort of over great distances again? Start sending out hunting parties and foraging parties, tear down or just leave your village and start doing it the sort of nomadic hunter gatherer way. Well, the reason that that's not an option any longer is this. They're sitting on talking about it. Okay, who remembers here how to go out and do hunting and gathering kind of the real way? Oops, that's right. We haven't done so in 4 generations. The last person that knew how died 100 years ago. They don't have the skills any longer. So what do? They can't hunt and gather by staying put. They can't hunt and gather by moving around. So they see no choice but to start putting those skills, that knowledge about plant and animal life together to domesticate plants and animals, which means to farm and to sort of increase the food supply, not by their own hand, by their own knowledge, by their own manipulation. So to domesticate, so that in a sense, then that at least some, if not more, peoples moved to agriculture not by choice. And the early years of farming, again, it happened in different places at somewhat different times, but the early, you know, decades, even centuries sometimes, uh, show that it was arguably a tougher life than hunting and gathering. The diet wasn't nearly as varied usually, as the last slide pointed out. Farming is far harder work, and in our world, just the jobs that we do are usually far harder work. So it was no picnic necessarily to move to a farming-based society, which is sort of the foundation for moving to the more plex model of civilizations worldwide, whether it be Chinese or Egyptian or Greek civilization. So farming, no wonder some of these people seem not to have wanted to move to farming, even though they had the ability and knowledge to do so. So what does it mean to domesticate plants and animals? To domesticate, of course, means to kind of bring under human kind of domestic control. And taken to its extreme, to the its logical conclusion, it means that the plants and animals, if they're fully domesticated by humans, they can no longer function or reproduce on their own or close to it. So think of animals that we domesticate, dogs as pets. There's evidence, I think fairly convincing evidence, that dogs were the very first animals ever domesticated by human beings. And they say man's best friend for good reason. They've been bred that way for tens of thousands of years for the traits that make them great companions, and indeed they are. I love my dog. So domesticated animals, right? But they lose the capacity, not always 100%, but sometimes close to it, to function on their own in the wild when they become domesticated. I know my dog couldn't survive. He couldn't survive 5 minutes in the wild. He doesn't even like to be let outside on his own. He gets scared and will sort of cry at the door. A few times he's gotten out on accident, and I hear this whining. Not in the backyard, in the front yard. He doesn't even run off. Some dogs go outside and they run down the block, or you lose them. Not my dog. He sticks right to the door and cries until you let him back in. So he wouldn't make it in the wild. Uh, a virtually fully domesticated dog. And the domesticated animals, sheep and goats, that were of economic benefit and had food value, whether through meat or milk, other cows and other such creatures. They had to pick out animals that were fit for it. So animals that could be domesticated. Some are too wild, and you can't domesticate them enough. You can't make them docile enough to be worth it to herd them, pen them, etc. So it has to be certain types, and you have to even then work on inbreeding those characteristics, selecting, I should say, those characteristics. I don't like the term inbreeding, selecting those characteristics that you want. But not all animals, you can even do that with. What about the plants? I like the picture here on the left. They're harvesting some type of grain, wheat, and to domesticate a plant, corn or wheat or whatever today, to make it part of agriculture or farming, you actually have to, or the process ends up such that the planted fields that you eventually create from the wild fields that you take wheat or barley or whatever from, eventually lose the capacity to reproduce on their own. Why? Because when you're going out and gathering wild growing wheat, which they did before farming, and gaining knowledge in the process, you notice fairly early on that the wheat stalks and plants that are the best for humans are the stalks or the seeds, the edible part of the wheat stay together. Right? It's sort of pointless if you pick something and then it sort of, as you're taking it from the plant to the basket and putting it in there, it breaks up, and they everything sort of flies into the wind. Uh, that's useless. But from the plant's perspective, that's exactly what it wants to happen. Right? Plant's goal, sort of purpose, have a purpose, at least from a biological perspective, is to reproduce, and that's how they reproduce. When those stalks get sort of blown into the wind and into the ground, spread out. So what's a good plant from the plant's perspective, the kind of that falls apart easily, is not what's desirable from the human perspective, which is the stalks intact. Those are the defective ones from the plant's perspective. But if you're harvesting wild grown wheat, you're going to just pick the ones, if you can, that stick together and stay together, and bring those back to your home. And if you then ever start farming nearer, closer by your, campsite or your town or village, you're going to be then planting those seeds that genetically, for reasons of genetic variation, random variation, that have the characteristics of staying together. And so over time, and you're doing this, planting season after planting season, pretty soon you get a field where there are virtually no or no wheat stalks that fall apart easily. They're all of the kind that you want. And if they don't fall apart, they don't reproduce. So this is how you go from plants that reproduce on their own to plants that don't reproduce at all. And that's then fully domesticated wheat or corn or whatever crop is being harvested in agriculture. That's not to say, of course, that there still aren't wild growing plants like wild growing wheat, but the stuff that's domesticated and turned into a field placed where human beings want it to be placed, those get domesticated in the sense that we just mentioned. By the way, I have to believe that the domestication of plants and animals, whenever, wherever it happened in the world, whatever time it happened in the world, remember different times, different places, somewhat, had to be a tremendous boost of confidence for human beings. It was one big way of controlling nature. Human beings have found many ways over the millennia, increasingly so, to manipulate nature. We know that partially because we've done a good job at destroying it in the process too, or at least parts of nature. Nonetheless, this must have been kind of a heady experience. Wow, we never realized we could control nature to this degree. Of course, there's parts of nature that we can't ever control that are just much bigger than us. All the more reason, though, why those aspects that can be manipulated and controlled would give confidence to human beings. In the sense, I picture them saying, "Oh no, we're not chasing the plants and animals around any longer. Heck no. We're going to bring the plants and animals right here to us. We're going to plant them right here outside our door. And right over there, we're going to pin in our animals. How about that, nature? We're not chasing you around any longer." I'm not saying anyone literally said that, but I think it was probably a confidence boost for humans, when this happened. So what effect did it all have? The Neolithic Revolution, the move to agriculture and domestication of animals, it started the process of permanent settlements, sedentary living, villages, towns, eventually cities, states, empires. You can see the political units getting bigger and bigger. This is over a long period of time, gradually. We start to see then, partly out of necessity, right, to challenge and response, or societies getting the thought they need, large scale social structures and systems, bureaucracies, political institutions, economic institutions, military, religious institutions start to grow, become better organized, bureaucratized, and you start to see then the move to what we call civilization, which is not necessarily a better way of life, but it's a more a complex way of life. Remember that sometimes when things get very complex, it can make them more difficult. Right? So, as they say, sometimes the simple life is a better life. And there's, I think, some reason to believe that's true in some ways. So, by saying that civilization means a more complex society, I am in no way saying it means a better society. That's arguable. The Neolithic Revolution itself, starting about 10,000 BP, or 10,000 years ago, this move we're talking about, as David Christian, who I rely on once again, says, stimulated population growth and encouraged humans to settle in large, concentrated communities we call villages and towns. Denser settlement encouraged more exchanges of ideas and stimulated collective learning, so that the pace of technological change accelerated. But larger and denser settlements also created novel social and organizational problems whose solutions required both new social relationships and larger and more complex social structures. So the advantages here, from a chart that I stole, of course, uh, steadier food supplies, though not always better and varied or as well-rounded a diet, but overall steadier food supplies, at least over time. Greater population could be sustained because there's more consistent and larger scale of food production. Uh, Organized societies capable of supporting additional vocations. So specialization of labor, which we'll see in the next slide or one of the next slides. So the people who become, known for doing one thing: soldiers, managers, traders, merchants, doctors, priests, etc., shoemakers, hunter-gatherers tended to be kind of jacks of all trades. I didn't say that before, but it's good to kind of bounce these, two off each other. Right? There were a few specialists and priests, but for the most part, everybody chipped in to do a bit of everything. That's now changing as farming changes the whole way of life, and the move to from hunting gathering to agriculture, when and where it happened, is a change across the board. It changes everything. The whole way of life, values, all the institutions and ways of doing things change to one degree or another. So it is really a revolution. Hence, the Neolithic Revolution as the label for this. We talked about farming beginning in a number of places. These are the 6 that are usually cited around the world. So 2 in the Americas. Nile Valley is Egypt, Mesopotamia, again, where Iraq is now, there, Indus River, India, and a number of places actually in China. But it may have popped up first independently in a couple other areas as well that aren't on this map. But so what we're saying, to repeat, is that these were all independent developments. Some of these places were technically close enough to learn from somewhere else, and it's possible that happened, say, from the Nile to Mesopotamia, or the other way around. It would have been, but not likely with the evidence that we have. So these are the 6 places that farming began, for sure, without sort of learning from somebody else, and then they spread from there. So Europe didn't have farming. It spread to Europe from Mesopotamia primarily over long periods of time. And now how does that happen? Well, one of the things that we see and will see when we look at early civilizations in various places is that civilizations that are, again, farming based, agriculture based, that then develop urban life because they can. They don't have to move around any longer, start to build cities, and their institutions, populations get bigger, more food, more trade, more wealth, more people, more soldiers. You see sort of where this is going. If they have neighbors that are still hunting and gathering, those neighbors can't compete. The kingdom, the agricultural society, sometimes these are called agrarian, which is another word for agriculture, empires. Agrarian empires next door to hunting and gathering groups are, there's just no competition. First of all, they're bigger. They can sustain a larger population. They have organized armies, not just warriors, with high-tech weapons. High-tech at the time. Chariots eventually, and bronze, eventually steel swords and helmets, and armor and things of this nature, bows and arrows. So these types of societies spread partially by force and conquest, and sometimes the peoples that are nearby, as we've already talked about, just pick up and go and move somewhere else, and so. Partly through warfare, through conquest, through migration, sometimes all of these combined, people bringing ideas with them, already knowing how to farm, perhaps, even if they didn't farm, start taking them to other areas. And from Mesopotamia, one of the directions it went was west or northwest, and eventually took farming to Europe in gradual steps and stages, but eventually spread throughout Europe as it spread through much of the world. Animal domestication, we won't go sort of back into that here, but you can sort of see some of the major early animals that were domesticated, and crops that were domesticated as well. And that's a lot, going thousands of years back in time. It might be surprising to you how many variations or varieties of plant and animal life were domesticated in one place or another. From this to that, what changed? I said everything changed, and that really did. From Paleolithic, Old Stone Age, to Neolithic, New Stone Age, to civilization. Keep in mind, civilization is the change taken to kind of its fullest and beyond. The Neolithic period in some ways is transitional between the Old Stone Age hunter-gatherers and sort of more modern people living in urban agricultural societies. Neolithic is kind of the again the transition. So small farming villages, some towns, cities start to pop up, but they grow, much bigger than that eventually. So more important, more sophisticated technology, breakthroughs in farming technology, agriculture gets better and better. Food surpluses are the result of that. Food surpluses, meaning extra food, more than you can eat, can be stored if they can be preserved. But more importantly, for our purposes, they can be traded for other goods and items that you don't have. So vigorous trade, large-scale trade, long-distance trade is a part of the move to Neolithic and beyond into civilization. Specialized workers, record keeping, complex institutions, advanced technology. Some of those are already mentioned. Specialized workers, let's go back to for a second. This is really important as a major change, explaining sort of how and why this is so different, urban life so different from hunter-gatherer life or urban-centered life. There are still lots of farmers, of course, because the cities have to be fed, but the center of most of these societies now is the urban areas. So specialization of labor means that people aren't jacks of all trades any longer from this point forward. They do basically one thing, which is basically all we have to do for the most part. And all we have to do to survive, I say all, not that it's easy, but all we have to do to survive is do one thing well. Right? All I know how to do is teach history. That's about it. But I get paid fairly handsomely for it, and so I can afford to everything else I need in my life, without having to go and make it myself. I don't make I mean, I cook, but my wife does mainly. But I, can do a little. I can do a little here and there, and but I don't have to go and shoot the food or fire a bow and arrow at it. I don't have to grow my own crops. I guess I could grow vegetables in the backyard. We're probably going to do that sometime soon. But you see the point. We're now living in a very specialized society on the other side of the Neolithic Revolution and the move to civilization. But specialization is partly what allowed breakthroughs in technology and acceleration of technological development. Because if hunter-gatherers are jacks of all trades, it means nobody's really devoted then, or hardly anyone, devoted to one specific trade. Now, in a city, everyone is. When I say now, I mean like in the early civilization, 5,000 years ago, everyone in the town and city is sort of specializes. You're a shoemaker or a leather maker, a potter, and on and on and on. And that then allows you to spend all of your time doing that and getting really good at it. And then teaching your son or your family how to do it and passing it down to the next generation. And this is, again, where knowledge becomes cumulative. This is where the technological breakthroughs happen. Like that chemistry textbook we mentioned, right? The son doesn't have to go back and learn by doing experiments and trial and error all the things his father learned how to do to make shoes more effectively, because his father taught him. His father kind of basically handed him the textbook, the equivalent thereof, and said, here, catch up, get up to speed, and then you can go from there. If the son had to go back and do all the things the father did, he wouldn't be able to advance any farther, most likely, than his father. So everything would sort of stay the same. Each generation would have to relearn what the previous generation learned. But this way, everyone specializes. They have the time and inclination to then teach the next generation in a fairly short amount of time, even when they're young. So by the time they become adults and functioning as shoemakers on their own, they now have all that knowledge, and they have a lifetime, an adult lifetime, to be creative, to be innovative, to think of new ideas, to find more efficient techniques. And this is happening in every industry, in every craft, in every trade. This is an explosive part of the move into civilization and agrarian agricultural empires. Most of the early civilizations that we see, we'll talk about, spring up in river valleys, fertile river valleys. So not all these we'll talk about, but you see the that in all places there's sort of a river system or two river systems that are there. The quote below talks about sort of the many ways in which this was indeed a revolution. Increased steady food supply, permanent settlements, we already mentioned, from villages to towns to cities to empires, craft specialization, which we just talked about, specialization of jobs, professions, the technological takeoff that came from there. Copper and bronze metallurgy are a good example of that. Another thing we haven't talked about that's definitely part and parcel of all this, comes with the territory, pardon the pun, is the move to private property, which brings with it growing inequality, and one could argue patriarchy too. The origins of the subordination of women kind of come along with civilization. So another a good example of how not everything in civilization is necessarily better than what came before. Women in hunter-gatherer societies weren't treated equally to men, but it was much closer than we see once societies move to these various civilizations that we'll be talking about and beyond. Inequality goes hand in hand with private property, as some people become wealthier and better off and have more property than others. Some have no property. Once you start sort of jealously sort of guarding what you have. Notions of property, by the way, I do think are somewhat misunderstood, especially today. If you say, well, we're protecting, or so and so believes in protecting private property rights, it's natural, I think, to assume, and it's understandable, that to assume that person is greedy. All they care about is money, and sometimes it's true. But keep in mind, private property doesn't just mean your home or land. It's any property that you own. If you don't have rights to private property, and the legal system doesn't protect your rights to private property, that means look around you right now. All the possessions you have in your room or in your car or wherever you are subject to someone taking them from you, government taking them from you, whoever. So private property isn't just about sort of greed to have lots of land and buy 5 homes and make a lot of money. It's about sort of being able to have some things that are your own, that are that are private property, and even a home is not just of economic value. It's sort of your inner sanctum, right? It's the one place you can go and sort of be away from the rest of society in your own little cocoon. So private property has been presented by historians over the decades, and still is by many, as being kind of an evil. And no doubt there's a downside to it. Inequality and patriarchy, right, are examples. But I am saying it's not all doom and gloom there. The expansion of trade, these growing societies, growing political units, from city-states to empires, eventually nation-states, have growing need for larger economies. They have more surplus crops to trade as the population gets bigger, the food supply increases, and on and on. So all these things are mutually beneficial and are interrelated and are kind of happening at the same time and intertwined. There's hierarchy and centralization, to be sure, in such societies, in such civilizations. As we'll see, hierarchy means power is top down, usually. Centralization means the power emanates from a central government. It could be a king, usually is in this early on in history, but it could be other arrangements that we'll see in this class later on as well. Institutional development, institutions, as already mentioned, political, religious, economic, become more complex. And there is, greed, or at least, strenuous effort and strong desire to protect what we have. And sometimes insecurity because of that. If you are the king of a very successful, very wealthy city-state in Mesopotamia, and your neighbors see how successful and wealthy you are, you just might want to spend some more money on defense and get a bigger, more high-tech army, because others are going to probably eventually come for your wealth. and try to take it from you. So there's a great deal of competition in this sort of world once we move to civilization in, again, one part of the world after another after another. One of the most famous villages that's been unearthed by archaeologists is Çatalhöyük, in basically what's now modern day Turkey. It's not the only village. There's been actually quite a few Neolithic villages found, but it's one of the biggest finds we've learned a great deal from. Marvin Perry, our lovable textbook author, says this changed the patterns of life. A food surplus free, he means towns like this. A food surplus freed some people to devote part of their time to sharpening their skills as basket weavers and tool makers. So specialization of labor, craft specialization. The demand for raw materials and the creations of skilled artisans fostered trade, sometimes across long distances, and the formation of trading settlements. An awareness of private property emerged. They now acquired property and were determined to protect it from one another and from outsiders. Nomadic herdsmen who might raid. A ruling elite emerged that possessed wealth and wielded power. So there's now sort of more wealth and power at stake, and so it becomes kind of more cutthroat within these societies and with regard to foreign policy. You can look at the chart on the left to see some of the features of early such cities. Jericho is another example of which is on this slide as well. But I'm not going to ask you anything specific about Çatalhöyük or Jericho. Craft specialization, artisans, we don't really need to go into this. Let me just read Christian's quote, and you can kind of read the graphic on your own time to study. Craft specialization, collective learning, the knowledge takeoff is something that could come up on our first exam when we get there. So this one you should probably study. Human language, Christian says, allows efficient transmission of knowledge from brain to brain. That means humans can share knowledge with great precision. So he's talking about collective learning, creating a common pool of ecological and technological or technical knowledge, which in turn means that for humans, the benefits of cooperation increasingly tend to outweigh the benefits of competition. So knowledge and skills can accumulate non-genetically from generation to generation, and each individual has access to the stored knowledge of many previous generations. Mainly what I have said already, he's just better at saying it than me. That's why he's a well-known, published, multiple time published author. What is distinctive about humans is that they can learn collectively. Collective learning is what gives humans a history because it means that the ecological skills available to humans have changed over time. Knowledge is shared with and between generations. Collective learning is so powerful an adaptive mechanism that one might argue it plays a role in human history analogous to that of natural selection in the histories of other organisms. The last part being a huge statement indeed. So David Christian thinks that collective learning, collective knowledge is in a sense at the center of explaining sort of human ability to function and to sort of make its way in the world. Thank you.